Welcome to this second session. What can we do as a church? NPM stands with all victims of abuse. Please know that this session will include conversations about sexual abuse and the abuse of power. This could be triggering for some. We encourage you to reach out to Into Account for additional support or to continue the conversation. We will provide contact information for Into Account at the end of our conversation today. My name is Amanda Bruce, and I am the Associate Director for Marketing and Communications for NPM. And I'm also here with Jennifer Klug, who is the Executive Director for the National Association of Pastoral Musicians. It is our pleasure to continue our conversation with Dr. Stephanie Krabel, the Executive Director and co-founder of Into Account. We are also glad to introduce Jay Yoder, co-founder of Into Account, for our conversation today. Into Account provides support for survivors and supports allies seeking justice, accountability, and recovery in Christian contexts. Stephanie is a scholar and advocate who specializes in social change movements, trauma, and institutional violence. And we are happy to have you both with us again to discuss these difficult but very important topics. Can you tell us a bit about the mission of Into Account and how it came to be?
Sure. Stephanie and I actually met when she was doing research on social justice movement in the Mennonite Church. And we started doing some grassroots sexual violence advocacy with Mennonites and other survivors in Christian contexts. We were trained by SNAP, Survivors Network for People Abused by Priests, so shout out to them. And then we decided we wanted to formalize the advocacy we were doing. We think our advocacy is special partially because the primary form of survivor advocacy hasn't really changed since its implementation in the 70s, which is geographic advocacy. So if someone experiences sexualized violence, they need to find someone near them who can help them, but that person may or may not be an expert in their specific context. So we provide advocacy services specifically in Christian contexts because we're very familiar with some of the responses that happen in those contexts, the way that power works, and just different cultural pieces of the context. So we formalized and became Into Account, and so that we could officially provide services through a nonprofit organization to survivors in that context. And I don't know if you have anything to add, Stephanie.
Okay, great. Thank you again for both being with us here today. This is our second conversation, but the first conversation that we had in this series was so important, so challenging, but also very enlightening. And so I so thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge on this important topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd also like to share my thanks. I know that you both talked about this in the first session, but for those who might not yet have the opportunity to view that session, would you take a few minutes and tell us why abuse, particularly sexual abuse, is so often unreported, and additionally, why legal recourse is rarely pursued?
Well, the difficult thing about sexual violence is it's most commonly perpetrated by someone that the person who is targeted knows, someone that the survivor knows. And so it's often a pastor, a coach, a friend's boyfriend, a cousin, a relative. And it's really hard for even the survivor themselves to understand what has happened to them and to process that someone they thought they trusted actually became sort of a violent threat to their person. And so the survivor themselves is going through a process of, wait a minute, what happened? How did it happen? And sort of reconciling that with themselves. And then they may be, so it may take them a while to do that. And when I say a while, I mean, it could be hours, it could be days, weeks, months, or even years for a survivor to fully process what has happened to them what it was and why it had such a big impact on their lives. And then even when they do process it, they may know that maybe this person is well loved, well respected in their family or community. And so they may know that if they report it, someone else is going to have trouble going through that process as well, of realizing someone that they trusted was capable of that kind of harm. And then we also just see some messages in the broader community that of people struggling to believe someone who has reported sexualized violence. So those are all reasons that someone may struggle to report or may not report. Stephanie, did you want to speak to the legal aspect?
Yeah, we can talk about the legal landscape a little bit too. So with all the realities that Jay just described in mind, you also have to add to that statutes of limitations. And in the United States, statutes of limitations are, it depends on a whole bunch of different factors, like what kind of sex crime we're talking about, the age of the victim, the age of the perpetrator, and what state you're in, because SOLs tend to be state by state. What we can generalize across the board is that they're very short in most cases, at least much shorter than you would think, given the gravity of the crime. Sexual violence just remains one of the most unreported and, crimes with the lowest rates of prosecution and conviction, given what we know about its ubiquity. So the short statutes of limitations are really frustrating for survivors. If it takes you 10 or 20 years to understand that the thing that happened to you when you were 13 years old, say, was rape that you weren't responsible for, was molesting, you weren't responsible for it. By the time where you feel like you might be ready to make a report, the statute of limitations might be expired. The statute of limitations is relevant in civil cases as well. There's also the fact that police aren't, sometimes police are good to report to, but frequently they aren't. And a lot of survivors just do not feel safe reporting to law enforcement. That's one of the reasons that when we are working with a survivor who does want to make a report to law enforcement, we make sure, if none of us are physically present, which is often the case because we're often working remotely, we make sure that they have somebody lined up that can go with them to report to law enforcement. Because, you want to think that every survivor is going to go into a situation in which they will be talking to somebody who is trauma informed. They will be talking to somebody who isn't assuming they are lying. However, law enforcement is a profession with its own very high rate of abusers, and it can be very stressful to report. And we're just talking about the beginning of the legal process. We also have the fact that prosecutors generally don't pick up cases that they don't think they can win. And then we have the fact that if something actually goes to trial, juries carry the same prejudices that we all carry. So the rate of successful convictions, very, very, very low, given the ubiquity of sexual violence as a criminal behavior. So, we cannot hang our hat on the legal system to save us from this. We really can't. It has never done a good job. It has never done well by survivors. We're speaking a few days after Bill Cosby was let out on a technicality. We know, part of why survivors don't report stories like that, just feeling like the odds are overwhelmingly against them and it's not worth the pain and suffering of reporting.
Yeah,
So,
and I wanted to point to the same thing. When we have these high profile cases like Bill Cosby, or I think particularly of Christine Blasey Ford, who testified about violence she experienced at the hands of Brett Kavanaugh. And when we watch these survivors go through these huge public ordeals, and Christine Blasey Ford had to move from her entire family from her home because of the level of threats and backlash that she got for even testifying. So when we look at these big high profile cases, what survivors learn is I will be punished, not believed, and the guy won't have any accountability anyway. Why would I go through all of this? And those are some sort of big high profile cases, but they set a national and cultural tone for how we're going to treat survivors.
I think too that that's a good place for us to transition into, of course, the reason, to be frank, why we started these conversations in the first place is because Into Account has been responsible for collecting the stories of survivors from the allegations against David Haas. And in the field of pastoral music, David Haas, and I'll just say in general, pastoral music composers are the people that we as pastoral musicians see the most as someone to look up to. They write the music that we so use for connection and prayer, and they're the anchors of what we do in pastoral music. But of course, part of this is because of his alleged use and abuse of power due to said celebrity culture. These people, I hate to say it, they're kind of our rock stars in a way. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to start with the first question today that really starts to unpack everything, which is, how does celebrity culture contribute to abuse in a creative and religious environment?
That's a great question. There are three big components that Into Account talks about when we talk about cultural factors that enable people to commit abuse, to target people for abuse. And those are access to a preferred target population, power over that preferred target population, and then the good regard of a wider community. And when we're talking about celebrity culture, we're talking not just about a standard sort of good regard for a person, but elevating someone to a level where they can almost do no wrong. And what we know is the access, the power, and the good regard of the community are key things that contribute to people not being able to believe that someone would be capable of that kind of violent predation. And so celebrity culture, takes it even further where, when people actually report, so first of all, it scares people out of reporting the truth. And second of all, when people do actually report the truth kind of just bounces right off of them because there's an immediate, celebrity, no, not him. And we could be talking about David Haas. We could be talking about a lot of spiritual religious leaders, musicians, composers, pastors, speakers in our communities. But that once people have reached that kind of level, we forget that they're human, and we forget that they're capable of kind of really deep harm. And so what we always say is, like, obviously not everyone who has access, power, and regard is a predator, right? I mean, hopefully each of us here has some level of good regard of our community members. If we have positions where we supervise people, we have some level of power, and we would then have like access to the people who respect us. We don't abuse those things. I hope none of us here engage in that kind of abuse or predation. However, something that's missing once people reach especially certain particular heights is that we remove all critical assessment of them. So where I think when people have access, power, and regard, we need to raise the level of critical attention that we're paying to them, because those things are risk factors. Instead, we lower the level of critical attention we pay to them. So I think it's just a cultural shift that we need to make. The higher someone rises, the more we need to be critical and pay attention to and keep an extra eye on how are they using that access? How are they using that power? How are they using that regard? And Stephanie, I don't know what, if you wanted to add some as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as you're talking, I'm thinking so much specifically about stories that, that I've heard from women who were abused by David Haas. And I mean, just to build on what Jay was saying, celebrity culture, it creates a form of power that has no accountability. It's resistant to accountability. There are structures for accountability, and when there are structures, they aren't stronger than the power that comes with the celebrity, for all the reasons that Jay described. So when women started reporting to Into Account, and I think it's worth talking about this a little bit, because Into Account is not the organization that you would expect 50 women, most of them Catholic, to report to. Yes, we had some training in, from Catholic survivors early on, but we've worked primarily in Protestant settings up until, about a year and a half ago. And it is the celebrity culture, the fact that we were completely outside of the celebrity culture, that had such a grip on the other people that they were trying to report to, is part of why so many women reported to us. Because, it was a handful, and then we were able to do some successful outreach. And then women started telling each other, these people don't have a dog in this fight, like they're just here to help survivors. And that's how we got the volume of reports that we did. So I think it's really, it's just a regular theme in the stories that women told us. They said he was an independent contractor everywhere. Nobody was holding him accountable. And while he has been, called out, and we're having this conversation, and he's not at this NPM convention, and, hopefully we'll never be at any again, that celebrity culture is still present. And there are many forms of abuse that are endemic to it. So when you have somebody who is so revered for their artistic gifts and their personality, that nobody feels that they can challenge that person without personal and professional repercussions in their own lives, that's when you've got to re-examine your culture. And that's tough, but it has to happen if you're going to prevent this kind of abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Stephanie, you just touched on culture, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. After you and Jay and all of the members of the Into Account team have walked with so many survivors over the past several years, not just in the past 18 months. Many of them are within the field of pastoral music. From your perspective, how does an imbalance of gender in race representation within the industry potentially play into exactly that culture of abuse and prime that setting, as you discussed?
Well, I have some preliminary thoughts, although I really am interested in how Jay builds on them. And this is everything that I've encountered in the process of working with survivors of David Haas within this Catholic pastoral musician community specifically. It's nothing that I haven't seen before. I'm not here to tell you that you all have like a uniquely horrible problem. Like, these problems are throughout our society. With that said, like, there's some specific things that I've noticed about the culture that survivors are reporting to me about. So I'm talking about it as somebody who has received a lot of survivor stories. That's and who has a lot of expertise in these patterns. And what I see is that women and people of color in particular feel like they're kind of like guests in this space. The space doesn't belong to them. And if they cause too much trouble, they won't be welcomed back. And causing trouble can include saying, this person who is, the king of this environment, this person who has so much power that nobody is calling them to account for anything, that person, called me 5 times at 2 a.m. That person pinned me in a corner and stuck his tongue down my throat. Like the culture that has been reported to me is a culture in which if you say, hey, that happened to me, could somebody please do something about this? The response is some version of, you're taking up an awful lot of space, little lady, aren't you? And the other thing that happens is, when you have a culture where the norms are dictated by white men, everyone who isn't a white man is, constantly testing the waters to figure out who they can trust, how much they can trust, how much space is going to be allowed for them to be their whole selves. And one of the underlying logics of white male supremacy is scarcity. We don't have the resources to welcome you. Everybody who goes against our norm is a drain on our resources. That doesn't have to be explicit because that's the underlying logic. So, for instance, one of the things that some of our survivors who reported to Into Account heard soon after they reported, shortly after they reported George Floyd was murdered, Black Lives Matter protests were all over the country, and white supremacist backlash was all over the country. And there was a sense that, oh, well, now it's time to pay attention to race. And it's not time, now survivors are taking energy away from paying attention to race. I mean, this is a ridiculous, false, we have to be able to talk about white supremacy and sexual violence together because they are intimately intertwined. But when you're coming from a logic of, well, everything that doesn't adhere to the white male norm within this space is a little extra thing that maybe we form a committee for, or maybe we host a little discussion about. But we don't want to do too much of that because that's detracting from our real work of being pastoral musicians. That mindset in and of itself is treating everybody who isn't a white man like a potential drain on the resources of the organization and the culture. And what we know is that the real drain are people who engage in predatory behaviors. The real drain is supremacist ideology that gets to lurk beneath everything. But that logic makes individual people feel like, okay, I might just need to put up with some stuff because if I complain about the stuff I'm putting up with too much, people are going to identify me as a problem and I'm not going to be asked back. And that's how a lot of careers either went on but cautiously or ended because somebody stepped too far when they said, I'm not okay with this. Jay, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would. I agree with all of that, and I would add in authority. That everything that you're naming, the way that we only allow space in the kind of top of the career for a few extras, a few women, a few people of color, and only if they're quiet and don't sort of speak to the bigger problems because then they're taking up too much space or becoming a troublemaker or causing problems. What that does is it contributes to who we believe are authorities on their own experiences and what they're allowed to talk about as part of their experience. So part of the problem with sexualized violence is that survivors are not believed, right? A lot of times we call it he said, she said. And of course, survivors and perpetrators can be any gender, but primarily statistically, it's men who are perpetrating, and the majority of survivors are women, but just to be clear, it can be anyone. But we often say it's he said, she said. And when we say that, we almost always believe the he, because men are considered authorities. Men make up the majority of leaders and top echelon celebrities in our culture. And so, that contributes to a culture of seeing them as authorities on what is true and real and factual. So the more let's put it this way: if we would expand and have a representative sample of leaders, musicians, pastors, folks at the sort of at the top, and if people were allowed to speak about the full spectrum of their experience, whether it's experiencing violence, oppression, discrimination, and all the rest of the fullness and richness of people's lives, then that could begin to start to balance out what we understand and accept as real and true, right? If, let's say, 50% of leaders and folks were women, and they were allowed to talk about the full spectrum of their experience without being called troublemakers or, pulling away resources, then we'd hear a lot of stories of survivors all the time, because a lot of people are survivors. And so we would begin to accept that as a something that women were uniquely qualified to speak about and to identify, instead of seeing it as something that doesn't happen too often, and maybe sometimes people are lying. And did you see that case? Bill Cosby ended up getting off anyway. And did you see that other case? We haven't even seen any charges against him. So are any of those women telling the truth? Right? Which is where we live now. But if we could envision a better future, it would be one where there's just much wider representation. Everyone's allowed to talk about all the parts of their lives, and then we begin to trust people as authorities on their own experiences. So that's one way it, I think, really impacts sexualized violence, to really have a limited set of demographics of folks who are the majority of people at the top of the field.
Mm-hmm. And Jay, I appreciate what you just said about allowing individuals to be the expert on their own experiences. And I think I'll admit, for certainly myself over the past several years in my own journey, my appreciation that I can't speak for another group or another individual. I can only speak for myself. That realization and appreciation has certainly grown stronger. But it's a journey. And how do we recognize those realities of sexism and racism within all aspects of our lives? We are within our pastoral ministry setting for part of the week, but then we go out into the rest of the world. And how do we recognize and wrestle with that?
Well, I think one way that we do it is by starting with that ethos that, okay, I'm going to trust people as the authorities on their own experiences, and apply that to your everyday life and see what happens in your conception of the world. That's what I feel like working in survivor advocacy as a white, straight, middle-class woman. I feel like that's that is one of the gifts that survivor advocacy has given to me, is that I'm not saying that I get it right all the time, but I have cultivated the discipline of not immediately imposing my own imagined idea of what this person might be experiencing when I hear somebody who I can't immediately relate to, because they aren't going through the world with my body and my experiences. They're going through the world with their body and their experiences, and they are the authority on those experiences. And one of the things that we see people struggle with so much is the idea that that they can't relate to, like, if they can't relate to somebody, that there must not be anything to see that they can't immediately see. It's sort of like, well, you are telling me that I'm being racist, but I don't feel like I'm being racist. So I think you're just misunderstanding me. I mean, how often do people of color have to deal with that load of nonsense from white folks? A lot. It's a form of white supremacist gaslighting that, like, we all become, like, as white folks, we all become fluent in very early. And so one of the ways that we can attend to this in our everyday lives is just to start paying attention to when we do that. And it creates this conceptual shift, because you're like, oh, the world is full of experiences that I don't have immediate access to, but just because I don't relate to them based on things that have happened to me, doesn't mean that I don't honor and respect their existence. That we're not always saying, yeah, okay, I know that happened to you, but, like, no, get rid of the but. Let people be people and have experiences that you may, like, assume that you don't know everything. That's a basic place to start. Assume there are things, if you have privilege, even if you also have areas where you're oppressed. I think this is an area where white women can mess up a lot, because we're women, we have to deal with men and their stuff all the time. So of course, like, why can't women just organize as women? Well, no, women of color have been organizing for years to try to get white women to understand that we can't generalize from our experiences about their experiences. So the humility of realizing that just because you have experienced one bit of oppression doesn't mean that you have access to the whole experience of being historically marginalized in this society. Like, that humility is a really important thing for all of us to practice.
Yeah, and I think there's another component too of we need to change the way we think about we need to complexify the way that we think about people who perpetrate violence. So part of the difficulty, Seymour agrees, obviously, I don't know if you hear him barking in the background, but part of the difficulty of being able to conceptualize, right? We talk about imagining someone who we trusted and we held up maybe even on a pedestal, and then moving to a place where we can understand that they were someone who could do harm. We sometimes think about it really in binaries, where it's like, if someone is capable of that kind of harm, then we need to throw them away as a human. And because that's a really extreme step, people can't get from I revered them to I need to throw them away into the garbage because they're a terrible person who is capable of great harm. And I want to complexify that and say, someone, we sometimes talk about in Christianity, right? We're all flawed, we're all capable of sin, we're all capable of harm. And I want to take that and say, yes. And that doesn't mean so we can just say, I'm sorry, and then it's washed away and gone forever. It means if someone is capable of that kind of harm, we need to look at what allowed them to do that kind of harm. We need to look at the power, the access, and the regard, which really gives someone the ability to target people over and over and over, and remove some of those things from their lives to help them stop perpetrating and to help keep people from being targeted, right? To prevent more violence. So I think there's a component of just, whether it's with racism or sexual violence or sexual harassment, we struggle to say we have the capacity for that kind of violence or discrimination or racism or whatever it is. And we struggle to say someone we really deeply respect has the capacity for that kind of violence and harm, because we conceptualize it in such a, if someone can do that, they're bad at their core, and they need to be thrown away as a human. I mean, it's something we hear all the time is you advocates take into account, you just want to destroy these men's lives. You just, don't you have, what about redemption? What about mercy? What about grace? To which I say, please, we talk about those things all the time. And for me, at least the way I conceptualize it, for mercy or redemption or grace to be present, we need to be actually accepting the depth of the violence and looking at how we can help someone not do it again. Like, first we have to accept the fullness of the violence. Then we need to look at how was it able to happen. Then we need to help them not do it again. And if we're able to do all of those things, we can start talking about redemption and mercy and grace. But I think we like to skip steps because it's hard to sit in that center part where, we know something violent happened. We feel powerless. We feel maybe deceived. We feel it just feels so complex, and we have to learn to be uncomfortable and sit in those complex spaces where we're accepting hard things, we're wrapping our minds around it, and we're figuring out what to do about it. So I think we just need to add a level of complexity and discomfort to our everyday lives.
Yeah, and in order to sit with that complexity, survivors have to be in charge of that step. That's why we never get there, because survivors tend to be people who aren't given the power to control the narrative or to say who's welcome into the space or not welcome into the space. Survivors tend to be people who are historically marginalized in one way or another, whether it's children, people with disabilities, people of color, women, queer people. All of those are categories of people who are targeted for sexual violence. And we got to listen to that. If we're going to enact accountability with an understanding that a perpetrator, yes, they are a whole person. And also, accountability is not the same thing as stripping them of humanity. Accountability should not be we're not talking about accountability as though it's something that annihilates a person, but people understand it that way because that's what they see. That's what they see when somebody who had a tremendous amount of power doesn't have it anymore. Well, his life is destroyed. Well, no, he's still a human being. It's not a fundamental human right to be able to have access to a bunch of people that you prey on. And so it's just, if we're going to get there, some people are going to have to give up power and listen to survivors. That's the step we can't get past because people don't want to give up power and listen to survivors.
I think too, from my perspective and from hearing both of you speak now, in the last session and this session too, I think for creative minds, I think it's a little complex because that power and regard is somehow intertwined with the art that they create. And I think I'll only speak for myself. I think that's hard. I think that makes things very challenging to kind of extricate that, which kind of leads me to my next question for you both. From Into Account's perspective, and this one is a little bit open-ended here. Can we, or how do we, or should we separate the art from the artist?
Jay, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it's a really good and a really tough question. And I think it's one of those ones that sits in that complexity and there's not an easy answer. I can speak from personal experience that there was an author that was really meaningful to me, who really helped me look at spirituality from a perspective that centered women's experiences and women's wisdom. who turned out to have abused her children pretty awfully. And so I grappled with that, when I found out, because she was the author of a book that I reread every year. And, I felt a bunch of complex ways about it. One of them was sorrow and grief that I didn't have that to return to. And one was, and I in part asked myself, do I have to throw away this piece of work? But at the same time, I felt violated in a particular way, that like this woman's words lived inside of me, had shaped some ways that I thought about things. And I wondered, like, did any of the like culture or specific ways that she could be violent seep into her writing and thinking, and therefore like did abusive ways of thinking and abusive culture sort of live inside of me from her work, right? It felt really complex to me, of like, oh, this meant so much to me and this was so meaningful, I'm going to miss it. And like, ew, I feel gross that her writing is so important to me, when she was a person capable of so much violence. And did any of that violence show up in the work, and therefore does it kind of live in me? And I actually talked to Stephanie about it extensively, because it was really important. And this is going to be slightly random, but I have owned the book, a physical copy of the book. And I said, what should I do with this book? Because I don't want to pass it on to someone else, and I don't want to donate it, and I don't want to burn it because I don't like burning books, and I don't want to throw it away because I don't like throwing away books. And Stephanie is an avid composter, specifically a worm composter, and she encouraged me to literally feed it to worms, because then they create beautiful soil out of it, and something else could grow out of that, which is kind of a funny random thing, but that is a personal way that I grappled with something that was really deeply important to me. And the other thing, and that's what I did with the physical form of that art. The other thing that I did when I thought about the sort of thinking and philosophies of the art, of the work of writing, and like what I could do with the sort of culture of it, was that I knew that she had influenced other new writers and thinkers, and that I could be grateful to what she had contributed to the field, and look into some people who had been influenced by her, who had not acted in violent ways, and who had created new works that I could engage with, that had built on her work and taken it to new and further and more modern places. So for me, that was the answer, was that I no longer had to rely on her for those ideas, because she had created a space where other people could build new ideas from it. And I know that's a friend of mine sort of took the same approach to a particular kind of theology. There's a theologian in Mennonite circles who turned out to be a prolific sexual abuser. And he attracted lots of new people to Anabaptist, the Anabaptist religion, Anabaptist thinking. And he was really meaningful to a lot of people. A lot of people ask the same question: can we still use this work even though this guy turned out to be bad? Maybe his work is okay, even though he's not. And what my friend, who was brought into the Mennonite religion through that theologian, did this sort of same thing. He said, he wrote his dissertation on this guy, and he was going to turn it into a book. And he said, never mind, I'm not going to do that. There are new thinkers and writers who are women, who are people of color, who represent a much more diverse representation, who have built on the space that he sort of created, and moved it into new spaces. And we can rely on those authors and thinkers and theologians to bring sort of the same direction of work, without relying on someone who is a predator. Because again, my friend was concerned that And I would argue, being familiar with the theologian, that some of his violent ideology had come into his writing and theology. And so we could push that away and look at the new people who had taken those ideas into new spaces, more diverse spaces, more creative spaces, more modern spaces. So that's kind of how, those are just personal stories of how I've worked with it. And I think Stephanie probably has some more to say about the same concept.
I'm glad you brought that one up. The worm ritual that we created there, because those things are important. I think what I don't want anybody to go away from a discussion like this thinking is that there isn't space to grieve the way Jay described grieving in that place. There is, even if your personal sense of violation, you don't have to say that it's equivalent to a survivor of that particular artist's abuse to take it seriously as something that is happening to you, that has happened to you, and that has shaped your development. You can grieve and you should grieve. But the other thing that's really important is to ask, okay, what purpose is this art serving for me and in my community? And what is the ethical heart of the community where we're using it? And who do we want to be? And that's the question that I would ask to people who are struggling with, are we going to use David Haas's music, for instance, given his centrality in post-Vatican II Catholic liturgical music, given how much it is built into the ritual of many people's lives, weddings, funerals, etc., how the intensely personal relationships that a lot of people have with his music. Yes, that is something, if you're letting that go, you don't have to feel like you can't grieve it. You can. There are appropriate places to express that grief. Probably social media threads where survivors are present are not an appropriate place to express that grief. But at the same time, the questions at the heart of this are, okay, what does it mean if you keep singing his music and just say, we love this music, we separate the art from the artist, and we can do that because we choose to, and we don't know any survivors anyway, so we don't have to worry about that. Well, you don't know that you don't know any survivors. What we do know about people who have the kind of predation patterns that he exhibited was that they victimize people everywhere. They're very opportunistic. The women who have reported to us come from all over the country, and Canada and Australia. So you can't assume that you don't have a survivor of Haas's direct abuse in your parish. You can't assume that. But you also can't assume that the decision to use his music won't affect other survivors in your congregation. It will. And I've heard from many survivors who weren't directly victimized by David Haas, but who have been re-traumatized in relation to their own abuse by the discussions about whether or not to use David Haas's music in their congregations. So it is a matter of, okay, if we want a community that truly values people who are historically marginalized, that puts people who are marginalized at the center of its ethic of compassion, which I think is what, at least in terms of lip service, what we think the church should be. It should be a place where compassion is not a finite resource. And yet, that is, if you insist on singing this music, you create a huge access barrier to your church for many people who have a lived experience of sexual violence. And that's a moral decision that you make when you decide to keep using that music. And I think rather than, for me, when people ask me about it, rather than thinking about separating the art from the artist, I don't know how you can do that with David Haas's music, because he used that music explicitly to groom and abuse people. But I would say, well, what kind of a community do you want to be? What do you want your choices to say about you? Who do you want to be welcome? answer those questions, and then make your decision based on that. And if you choose to still use his music, you have to accept what that says about you as a community.
A follow-up question to this, to stay on this just for a second. Other than sharing the link to this presentation, this discussion with someone, if we come across those who struggle with this question, because as both of you have shared so much perspective, this is still a topic that unfortunately, it, like as you've alluded, is challenging for pastoral ministers. How do we best educate others into the full context of the situation without giving more power and attention to the abuser? Or is that even possible?
No, I don't totally know where to begin. Jay, do you have?
Yeah, I mean, so I would recommend first that people read about it, about this conversation via another situation, right? So if folks are struggling with David Haas's music because the emotional attachment is to that music, for example, then to get them a little distance from the particular situation, I would recommend they read something about how people have grappled with other similar situations. So I would read a survivor of Bill Cosby and how she relates to the Cosby Show, or a survivor of John Howard Yoder is the Mennonite theologian and how she relates to his writing, or just a survivor of sexualized violence and how they relate to the art of celebrity perpetrators. Watch the documentary about Woody Allen that recently came out on HBO. You know, I would recommend people think about it in a broader way about a different artist. So that, again, because when we're really attached to something, we can think of all sorts of reasons why it's okay in this one circumstance to, you know, to hold on to this art. So I would recommend first think about other kinds of art and how survivors relate to it. And then I would ask, you know, I would ask people, if we believe the survivors, right? Because part of what we're going to want to do if we like a particular piece of art is say like, well, maybe this time the survivors are lying. But I want to ask ourselves, if we do believe the survivors, you know, and we've read these other survivors talking about how they relate to, you know, celebrity artists who have turned out to have patterns of abuse or predation, then I would go back to Stephanie's question of, then who do I want to be and how do I want to relate to this work? You know, so just, I mean, I think it's a hard thing because when we're deeply attached to something and when it's meaningful to us, like the book I was talking about, you know, I think there was probably a little bit longer of a period of time where I said, I don't know, maybe it's maybe it wasn't as bad as I think, so I can still read it, or maybe, you know, maybe it didn't bleed into the work, so I can hold on to it, right? So that's why I say, like, well, take a little distance and read about different works of art and think about how you would want to relate to those, and then come back to yourself and the piece of art that you're attached to and think, okay, if I believe these survivors, how do I want to relate to this work of art? That's my best advice.
Yeah, and to that list that you of things to look at, like the 6-part documentary series Surviving R. Kelly, that's a really good one for that. I would recommend that specifically to people who are struggling with the David Haas music question, for a whole bunch of reasons. The other thing, I mean, Jay and I, once we were really struggling with a case not related to to this discussion at all, but we're really struggling with the case where a community just did not want to believe the survivor. They just didn't. They didn't want to believe that it was and continues to be so ugly. And I remember at one point Jay saying, geez, do these people think that we've never faced, like, we faced 1,000 truths that we hate? That always stuck with me when you said that. Like, we faced 1,000 truths that we hate. Like, advocates aren't here to rain on your parade. We're here because we have experienced violence, and because we've spent a lot of time with people who have experienced violence, and because we have a genuine conviction that it doesn't have to be this way. And I think a lot of the resistance that you encounter, like when you're talking about how do we educate people who just don't want to talk about this, like, yeah, we're talking about people who say, well, I don't need to, this doesn't have anything to do with the music that I sing on Sunday morning. Like, that it could be that level of resistance, but usually the resistance is deeper. If there's a real resistance to listening to survivors about like music choices on Sunday morning, probably the resistance is deeper. Probably there's some, do I really have to let a bunch of women I've never met tell me like anything? And I think there's just this, I do think that we tend to think that sexual violence is inevitable. And so one of the underlying things that's happening when people are utterly resistant to education, utterly resistant to changing their mind, I think sometimes it just feels, the idea that this could ever be changed feels hopeless. And they don't, all of the language around transforming these cultures feels monumentally disruptive to them. And they just want it to go away. That's what you're coming up against when you're trying to educate somebody who's resistant. Often you're coming up against somebody who just wants this whole thing to go away. And sometimes you're going to get through, and sometimes you have to walk away. And that's something that we end up, talking to survivors about a lot, because survivors end up doing so much traumatic or re-traumatizing work trying to educate people. And it's terrible, and they shouldn't have to do it. And sometimes it's people who are just re-traumatizing them with their utter resistance to accepting the horrible reality that this person is trying to share with them. So when you sense that somebody just, they're just not going to go there, sometimes you need to cut your losses because it's not worth your energy.
My last question to kind of wrap up this whole section has to do with accountability. Now, I will say that we've already kind of addressed this a little bit because Jay pointed out in the beginning, of course, the 3 pillars that you have found, which are, of course, access, power, and regard. But I'd love to touch on it just one more time. What would accountability for an abuser and their enabler look like in our pastoral music ministry context?
Jay and I are just staring at each other like, who's going to take this?
Yeah, so those are the 3 big things that we target, right? Because there's been a lot of energy spent for decades looking at how do we change the mind and heart and behavior of the person who's doing the targeting. And then we have an entire legal system that's pretty much solely punitive. It's pretty much solely something we agree something bad has happened, here is your punishment, and not at all focused on, really, maybe it stops the person if they're incarcerated, they're unable to target people for that period of time, but it doesn't necessarily stop them in the future, right? And so there's focus on hearts and mind, there's focus on punitive, incarcerating someone. We think our approach is really different, which is the approach of removing someone's access to the population that they prefer to target, removing the power that they have over the population that they're targeting, and removing the good regard of the community. So, you know, depending on context, it can look like a couple different things. It can, and we've seen some of those in recent contexts, right? It can look like removing contracts, removing positions, you know, and some of them are very concrete. So taking someone out of the position, stopping hiring someone for particular gigs, shutting down camps or different places where a lot of times perpetrators like to set up particular kinds of access for themselves. So removing someone as from a mentor role and those kinds of things. And then the good regard of the community has to be a cultural shift, right? So it's not something you can do in one move, right? One concrete move. It's spreading the word throughout a community so that we're all collectively on the lookout for this person. And it's, you know, we're paying attention to you now. We know we're now aware of what you like to do, and we no longer trust you with our community members, with ourselves or our community members. You know, do we like to also see things like financial restitution? Yes. Do we also like to see things like, would we love it if someday a perpetrator admitted to the fullness of the violence they have committed and asked what they could do to make things right? Absolutely, I would love to see that. But those aren't things that we wait for or that we waste our time and energy trying to achieve, because we have watched decades of efforts towards those things fail. So what we, you know, when we have had cases that we consider to be successful, we have managed to remove the good regard of the community and hopefully separate someone from some of their access and some of their power. So those are I mean, there are different kinds of accountability, but that's what we work towards it into account. And that's what we encourage other folks to work for, because while it may not stop them 100%, we think it will deeply limit how much people are able to target folks for violence. You remove that access, you remove that power, you remove that regard. That's a lot of barriers to someone for being able to target folks again successfully.
Yeah, and to support that, I think we also have to be really conscious of false equivalencies that happen when a perpetrator starts to experience those consequences. Because often what will happen is that person's enablers and friends and defenders will say, well, hasn't he suffered enough? His entire life has been destroyed. This is, you know, he's suffering so much now. These women are so angry. They're victimizing everybody. There is a lot of projection that happens every time abuse goes public like this. One thing that a lot of survivors in this particular case with David Haas have been re-traumatized by is a lot of just incessant talking about cancel culture and how now he's a victim of cancel culture. Well, I mean, I find that term, it just, whenever somebody uses the term cancel culture in these circles, I feel like it's the end of any productive discussion, because it's not something that's welcoming people into a discussion about what real accountability would look like. It's just a way of saying, it's just a way of batting people away. It's a political red herring that people can just throw around. Accountability looks like public exposure, particularly when you're talking about somebody who is coming down from a tall pedestal. There is no way to hold them accountable without people knowing what they have done. And so that's not something that goes away after a year. There isn't a period of time where he's now suffered enough, because this isn't about like an amount of suffering that is appropriate for a perpetrator. This is about protecting people from violence. And if you are somebody who's concerned about the perpetrator, this is about protecting the perpetrator from the opportunity to commit violence, if you want to think about it that way. And it's when you really commit to doing this work, you have to be aware of all the rhetorical tools of distraction that will come up as soon as you start naming this violence for what it is, and as soon as you start naming names of perpetrators. Because there is the acronym DARVO, deny, accuse, reverse, victim, and offender. I may have brought it up in one of the other sessions, I can't remember. But that will go into full effect very quickly when you have somebody who has a lot of social power. The people around them will employ it on their behalf. And one of the things that, if you want to be a good ally to survivors, one of the things that we can do is just be a stalwart resistance to that DARVO. Say, no, everyone is entitled to their feelings. Everybody, you can have your feelings, but you can't do these false equivalencies. You just can't. And just keep recentering on the need for accountability. And accountability it can't happen without people knowing this person did this.
Yeah, and some of what Stephanie is describing there too is moving that community regard over to survivors. The more people with expertise and trustworthy reputations in communities that stand with survivors, the better, because that helps with accountability as well, right? Someone who has been on a high pedestal has a lot of people staking their reputations with him. We need to be staking our reputations with survivors to sort of counterbalance that, so that we help people move in that way we've been talking about, from seeing someone as really trustworthy to understanding that that person is capable of harm. And to get from here to here, the people who already trust and believe survivors need to, vocally, publicly put their names and reputations with survivors and say, yeah, I believe these folks. I believe these folks that this is true, so that we can start moving to understanding that this person is capable of that kind of harm. And yeah, I just want to reiterate, I said it already, Stephanie just said it too, but yeah, it's this, while the legal system is punitive and is about causing suffering and incarcerating, that's not the kind of accountability that we look at. When people say, like Stephanie is saying, you're destroying his life, you're ruining everything. No, no, we're removing access. We're removing power over those people that he likes to target. And we're removing the good regard of the community so that he doesn't have a free pass anymore. It can still exist. In general, most of our survivors either don't have access to the legal system, or don't want to use the legal system, or it's not working for them. So we're not even talking about putting someone in jail. We're just talking about, as Stephanie said, someone moving from a huge pedestal to moving to a place where we are keeping an eye on him, making sure that he's not having access, power, or regard. And that looks and feels, to people who have had a lot of power losing it, looks and feels like punishment to them. They might feel it in their body like punishment, or it might be observed from outside as punishment. It's not punishment for punishment's sake. It's removing things that allowed him to target people for violence. And that's, I think a really reasonable response to violence is to say, what allowed you to do this? Let's try to remove those things for you and for them. And so, yeah, I mean, it's also a shift in the way that culturally we think about things. I think our whole American society is a big, you did a bad, here's some punishment for the bad. And that's not theologically how we think about things, and that's not ethically how we think about things, and practically it's not how we think about things. That's not what prevents future violence. So we need to shift into the space where it's like accountability isn't about punishment or destroying someone or taking them down or causing suffering. Accountability is about prevention, truly, at its heart.
Jay, Stephanie, I want to thank both of you for joining us again today. You have provided such a rich and valuable conversation, but also contextualized it with actionable steps for us to take away, reflect upon, and actually change our culture for the better. So I thank you for that. To our viewers, I invite you to visit Into Account's website, which is intoaccount.org. There you can learn more about the work that Into Account has done over the past several years. You can learn about ways that you can support their work. And of course, there is the ability to report your own story of survivorship, should that apply to you. We invite you to view our other 2 episodes, parts 1 and 3. This is the 2nd episode. We thank you for joining us today. I would like to thank my colleague, Amanda Bruce, for joining us as well. And again, we invite you to visit intoaccount.org to learn more. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.